All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the mind of a guy who basically hacked human psychology decades before the word psychoanalysis was even a blip on the radar. We're talking about Fyodor Dostoevsky and how he took the traditional 19th century novel and completely shattered it, turning it into this pioneering and frankly often terrifying exploration of the human mind. Honestly, if you've ever felt completely torn between two choices or just paralyzed by your own conflicting thoughts, well, you are already living in Dostoevsky's universe. I mean, just think about the sheer weight of this quote for a second. Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosophical titan who rarely handed out compliments to anyone, and who fundamentally disagreed with Dostoevsky's religious views, openly admitted that Dostoevsky was literally the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. Nietzsche recognized that Dostoevsky had managed to map out the darkest, most contradictory corners of the human psyche long before anyone else even dared to peek in there. It's a massive testament to how spot on his character studies really were. So, to wrap our heads around these massive conceptual collisions, we're going to hit 5 key areas today. First, forged in Siberia's fires. Second, the anatomy of the mind. Third, the burden of absolute freedom. Fourth, guilt, suffering, and redemption. And finally, legacy of the divided self. Starting off with Section 1, forged in Siberia's fires. You see, you really can't understand Dostoevsky the visionary without first grappling with Dostoevsky the survivor. His philosophy wasn't cooked up in some cozy, quiet academic library. It was forged in the dirt and the freezing cold. His life swung from one extreme to another. Born in Moscow in 1821, he actually started out writing fairly standard social tales. But then you hit 1849, and this is the ultimate pivot point. He's arrested for joining the Petrushevsky Circle, which was a slightly subversive intellectual group. He is subjected to a terrifying mock execution. He literally believed he only had moments to live before the guards lowered their guns at the absolute last second. That unbelievable level of trauma shifted everything, launching his deep psychological works like Notes from the Underground in 1864, right up to his massive masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov in 1880. And honestly, this is exactly why his work hits so incredibly hard. Consider these deeply visceral biographical traumas. His father was murdered back in 1839, which introduced these haunting, early themes of patricide and intense guilt that show up later in his books. Then, right after that 1849 mock execution we just mentioned, he was immediately thrown into 4 brutal years in a Siberian prison, followed by forced army service. By the time the 1860s roll around, he's battling deep poverty, a completely crippling gambling addiction, and incredibly complex emotional affairs. These traumas just completely shattered any naive illusions he might have held about human rationality. He lived through the absolute darkest parts of the human experience, setting the stage for the intense, chaotic fiction we're exploring today. Moving right along to Section 2, the anatomy of the mind. So, the big question is, how do you actually translate that kind of intense, fragmented human experience into a novel? Well, he basically utilized a revolutionary narrative technique to do it. Later dubbed polyphony by the critic Mikhail Bakhtin, this is a style where multiple, completely conflicting voices coexist without any final judgment from the author. It's brilliant because it perfectly mirrors the chaotic structure of our own unconscious minds. Long before Sigmund Freud was drawing up charts of the id, ego, and superego, Dostoevsky was just letting these psychological forces brawl right there on the page. Think about a character like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He is endlessly arguing with his own inner voices. His cold, calculated logic is clashing violently with his deep, unshakable spiritual guilt. And the wild part? Dostoevsky doesn't step in to tell you which voice is right. He just steps back and lets the chaos play out. Which brings us to this seriously creepy but brilliant concept he perfected, doubling. In his early novel, The Double, the main character Godlyadkin is literally haunted by a doppelganger. But this isn't just a ghost story. This double embodies all of the social confidence and ruthless ambition that Godlyadkin himself completely lacks. It's giving a physical, walking, talking form to the fractured self. It is the terrifying return of the repressed unconscious, externalizing the very parts of ourselves we desperately try to hide or disavow. It really forces us to see just how divided we truly are. All right, Section 3, the burden of absolute freedom. Now that we've got a handle on how he wrote, let's get into the actual philosophical battleground. And for Dostoevsky, absolute freedom wasn't some beautiful utopia. It was pure, unadulterated terror. Listen to the narrator from Notes from Underground. He says, "What man wants is simply independent choice, whatever that independence may cost and wherever it may lead." What Dostoevsky is doing here is revealing a core existential paradox. He's forcefully pushing back against the Enlightenment idea that humans are entirely rational creatures who just want a perfectly organized, happy society. No way! He insists that we will willingly act completely irrationally. We will literally self-sabotage just to prove we have free will, just to prove we aren't mere piano keys being played by the laws of nature. So what actually happens when the guardrails come off? Mapping this out impartially, it's wild to see the contrast between two absolute heavyweights. Dostoevsky firmly believed that freedom is an incredibly heavy burden. Without spiritual truth or God to anchor it, it becomes actively dangerous, a fast track to destructive nihilism. Unmoored freedom, for him, is an existential catastrophe. Now, Nietzsche analyzes the exact same human condition, but views this exact same freedom as ultimate liberation. For Nietzsche, the death of God isn't a cause for despair at all. It's a liberating call to revalue all values and become the Übermensch, or Superman. They're looking at the exact same concept of radical freedom, but drawing totally opposite conclusions on what it does to the human soul. And you see this absolute anxiety of choice completely dismantle the characters in his greatest work, The Brothers Karamazov. Take Ivan Karamazov. He endlessly intellectualizes the problem of evil, formally rejects God's world on purely moral grounds, and because of that, he becomes completely morally adrift, leading to absolute disaster. Then there's his brother, Dmitri. He's totally paralyzed by the clash between his sensual indulgence and his deep spiritual longing. And maybe most famously, you have the Grand Inquisitor. This is a brilliant parable created by Ivan that essentially argues humanity actually prefers comfortable, well-fed authority over the crushing, agonizing burden of free choice. The Karamazovs basically prove that abstract philosophical theories about freedom aren't just thoughts in a vacuum. They have devastating real-world consequences. This brings us to Section 4, Guilt, Suffering, and Redemption. Let's put Dostoevsky on the psychoanalytic couch for a minute here and explore how his characters handled the massive weight of guilt and how radically it differs from modern psychology. There is a huge divergence in thought. Look at Freudian psychoanalysis. Freud basically viewed suffering as a pathological symptom of repressed desires. It's a neurosis, right? Something that needs to be analyzed, explained, and medically cured so the patient can go back to functioning normally. But Dostoevsky's Christian existentialism? Totally different lens. He elevated suffering as a potentially redemptive force. For him, it isn't a medical symptom to be magically erased. It's a painful but absolutely necessary path to confront the truth of the human condition and eventually achieve spiritual grace. You see this so vividly in characters like Sonia in Crime and Punishment. She takes immense suffering and transforms it into profound dignity. You see the exact same split when we talk about the act of confession. Freud's famous talking cure relies on verbal confession to bring all that unconscious guilt out into the open, specifically to alleviate those neurotic symptoms. Now, Dostoevsky's confession scenes, which are always these incredibly feverish, intense moments, act as a very early, intuitive version of this talking cure. But the end goal is completely different. For Dostoevsky, spiritual confession isn't about feeling better. It's an act of submission to divine grace. It's an acknowledgement of universal communal responsibility. Basically, Freud wanted to clear the repressed mind. Dostoevsky wanted to clear the soul. So how does this heavy guilt actually play out in everyday life? Well, if you look at Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, he experiences overwhelming guilt, deep paranoia, and terrifying hallucinations long before he's ever physically arrested by the authorities. The real punishment wasn't the threat of a Siberian jail cell. Actually, scratch that. The real punishment was the inner tribunal. It's the punishment inflicted by his own hyperactive conscience. It brilliantly anticipates the Freudian concept of the superego, proving that the true psychological punishment begins the very second the moral boundary is crossed, regardless of who's watching. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, Legacy of the Divided Self. It's amazing to see how Dostoevsky's turbulent 19th century worldview directly laid the groundwork for the 20th century existentialists. When you map out how these heavyweights align and diverge, it's fascinating. Dostoevsky sees a divided self that needs unity through redemptive suffering and universal guilt. Kierkegaard is somewhat similar. He sees a synthesis requiring God, defining guilt as an estrangement from the divine. But then look at the later French thinkers. Sartre argues that the self is simply condemned to be free, and guilt is just bad faith, basically lying to yourself to escape your own responsibility. And Camus? He views the self as confronted by a totally meaningless, absurd universe, completely post-moral with no inherent guilt at all. What this proves is that whether you vibe with the spiritual redemption of Kierkegaard, the radical freedom of Sartre, or the noble resistance of Camus, they were all fundamentally answering the deep, profound psychological questions that Dostoevsky was the very first to ask. And all of this really just leaves us staring down one final, incredibly haunting question. Do you truly desire absolute freedom, or is the burden of infinite choice too heavy for the human psyche to bear? Ultimately, Dostoevsky leaves us staring right into the abyss of our own minds. He forces us to wonder if we actually want the radical freedom we are constantly demanding, or if, deep down, terrified by the overwhelming responsibility of our own fragmented selves, we just want someone to tell us what to do. It's a heavy thought, for sure, but an absolutely crucial one. So keep that in mind the next time you face a paralyzing decision. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning everything.